Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. As an example of the rampant insanity of U.S. politics at the federal level today, there is a draft resolution circulating in the U.S. Senate right now. It is sponsored by representatives from both major parties, Senator Bob Casey from Pennsylvania and Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, of "shut up, you don't get a lawyer" fame when he defended the indefinite detention provisions of the NDAA, and Joseph Lieberman, an independent, former Democrat of Connecticut, who is known to be one of the most hawkish and belligerent senators in Congress. What this resolution states is that the sense of the Senate is to rule out any possibility of containment of Iran should Iran obtain nuclear weapons. Now, for some historical perspective, containment is precisely the strategy that was used by the United States vis-a-vis the Soviet Union back when, during the Cold War, each side had tens of thousands of nuclear warheads pointed at the other. Now, this was a very dangerous time. Indeed, for about 40 years, the world stood on the brink of nuclear annihilation. Even if the actors during the Cold War could be assumed to be rational, at least insofar as they didn't want human civilization to be destroyed, still, on a few occasions, it came perilously close to being destroyed because of a possible misunderstanding or even an accident, a misinterpretation that the other side would have attacked. One such incident, of course, occurred during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when only negotiation between John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev was able to dispel the tension and bring the world back from the brink of annihilation. But containment, the idea that if the other side is to obtain nuclear weapons and to be in a somewhat threatening posture, the goal is to prevent the spread of that threat, but not to go out in an all-out attack. That was the policy that the United States followed, and one could say successfully because we didn't all get blown up. Now, the Senate is at least contemplating ruling that out if Casey, Graham, and Lieberman have their way. This is very dangerous. It's dangerous first because it lacks historical perspective. After all, if Iran were to get nuclear weapons, well, how many would it have? Would it have 2, 3, maybe 10 at the very most, compared to the tens of thousands of the Soviet Union? And yet the sponsors of this resolution are explicitly saying that for some reason, this situation is not comparable to the situation that existed with the Soviet Union. Do you think the leaders of Iran would dare to launch their measly arsenal of nuclear weapons, if they ever managed to get any, at the United States, knowing how many the United States has to launch back at them in retaliation? Sure, they're theocrats and thugs and thoroughly repugnant individuals. They oppress their own people hate them, and would like nothing more than to have some social freedoms, some political freedoms, some economic freedoms. But do you think these people would sacrifice their own lust for power in order to attack the United States, or to attack Israel, which has many more nuclear weapons than they do, and is even more likely to retaliate than the United States? Clearly, there is no reason to believe that Iran, even if it were to obtain nuclear weapons, is going to be even a fraction of the kind of military and geopolitical threat that the Soviet Union posed. But unfortunately, jingoism is in ascendancy in Congress. And this is why we need a candidate like Ron Paul. This is why we need Ron Paul to be elected. Because he is the voice of reason in this election. He is the person who is saying, look at history. Look at what happened when the other side didn't just have a few nuclear weapons, had almost as many as the United States. And negotiations were still pursued. A policy of containment was still pursued. They weren't ignored by any stretch of the imagination. And to be sure, the United States made numerous mistakes in its Cold War foreign policy. Indeed, by being too aggressive, by propping up many dictatorial regimes, such as the regime of Saddam Hussein or the regime of Shah Mohammed in Iran, whose overthrow then led to the current theocracy and whose reign sparked a very long-standing hatred against the United States for propping up this murderous thug. Well, think about it. If the United States, with its very imperfect policy of containment, managed to survive and indeed win the Cold War, then what does that say about a backward, miserable, stagnant theocratic regime like Iran? Here's what I think is going to happen in Iran. The population is overwhelmingly young. And of all the countries in the Middle East, the population of Iran is the most sympathetic toward the United States and toward Western culture, Western economic principles, Western lifestyles in general. This is because they've seen glimpses of that world. They've seen glimpses of the economic and technological potential that even we in the very mixed economies of the West and the limited freedoms that we enjoy in the West here are able to harness. They want that too. Now, Iran is ruled by a very small oligarchy of very backward fundamentalist theocrats. Do you think, given the demographics of Iran, this situation is going to last more than another 10 years? Especially given the protests that have been happening in Iran already? But I can tell you what will happen if the United States attacks. If the United States attacks Iran, the public perception is going to change overnight. Because all of a sudden, these young people who once admired the West and looked up to it as, if not an ideal to be reached, at least something to be emulated in certain aspects, well, now they're seeing their parents, their brothers, their children torn to shreds. Torn to shreds by American bombs. How do you think that's going to affect what they believe? The implicit sense that I'm getting from this Senate resolution, although it is a non-binding resolution, it will have a lot of political clout if it is passed, is that it will essentially encourage war. If Iran obtains nuclear weapons or makes progress toward obtaining nuclear weapons, this resolution will say very strongly the president ought to send American troops or American bombs at Iran. War is terrible. War is monstrous. In war, most of the people who are harmed have done nothing wrong, even if they're the subjects of a regime that is terrible and heinous, such as the regime of Iran. They're innocent civilians. They have no choice. If they speak up too loudly against that regime, they will be tortured, they will be persecuted, they will be imprisoned, they will be killed. They might try to escape, but their chances aren't that high. They might try to keep a low profile and just survive and take care of their own little circle of family and friends. But they're not evil people. Most people are not evil people, even if they live under a heinous regime. I know this, because I was born in the former Soviet Union, back when it was the Soviet Union. My family lived under the Soviet regime. We knew a lot of good people there who also lived under the Soviet regime and just tried to lead their own private lives with very many of the same goals, very many of the same hopes, very many of the same talents, and all the other human characteristics that people in the United States and in the rest of the Western world have. These are human beings. And ultimately, we have to remember the cries for war are cries for the elimination of innocent and peaceful human beings, often human beings who are stuck in terrible situations for no fault of their own. We also have to remember the cries for war are cries for our own impoverishment. Considering that the United States has just surpassed the ruinous 100% debt to GDP ratio. That means it would take all of the output of the United States economy for 1 year, as measured by conventional economic statistics with all of their failures, and then some, to pay off the colossal national debt that we have now, in excess of $15 trillion. And Graham, Casey, and Lieberman want to add more to that by sending US troops on a war that's going to be several times more massive and more expensive and more bloody in terms of American lives lost, and certainly in terms of the lives of Iranian civilians lost, than the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. What are these people thinking? Where do they think they're going to pay for this? How do they think they're going to be able to avoid drafting young people in America in order to pay with their time, with their skills, and with their blood for the deluded fantasies of geopolitical power that these elites, these old, manipulative, cynical elites have? Why in the world do a few old elite senators believe that they have the right to send American young people off to fight and to die for those senators' own objectives while they continue to lead lives of luxury and prestige and privilege and influence? That's the question we should be asking. And that's the question that Ron Paul is asking. Unlike most politicians in the United States today, Ron Paul is posing a challenge to what can be termed the welfare warfare paradigm. On the one hand, the federal government attempts to exert its might domestically through an overarching web of programs aimed at restricting economic activity, controlling the peaceful and consensual decisions that individuals make, for instance, via the war on drugs, and essentially putting the hand of the federal government into every area of our lives. What is happening domestically is also happening abroad, with the very misnamed and misguided war on terror, which has strayed very far from the original intention of hunting down the people responsible for the terrible attacks of September 11th, 2001, and has instead become an excuse for the United States to continue to maintain a massive military presence in countries and in occupations that are pretty much unrelated to those particular attacks that claimed so many American lives. It's important to recognize the connections between the two, but we have a kind of false dichotomy in the mainstream political establishment. Some on the left, on the conventional left and in the Democratic Party, claim to decry the warfare part of this paradigm, but to embrace the welfare part of this paradigm, whereas on the other side, on the so-called right, or the Republican Party, many claim to decry the welfare part of this paradigm, but embrace the warfare part of this paradigm. Really, they're both part and parcel. They're both two sides of the same coin. Ron Paul understands this. Ron Paul offers a consistent philosophical defense of liberty, which involves a rejection of both of these. A recognition that the federal government should scale back in both of these areas. Stop intruding on people's liberties, both at home and overseas. Leave individuals to peacefully pursue their own betterment. That is what Ron Paul's campaign is all about. Leave individuals to engage in peaceful commerce and to benefit from what they have to offer one another, be they here in the United States or be they abroad. As Thomas Jefferson advised, we should have peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. I really hope that the US Senate rejects this terrible, belligerent resolution by Casey, Lieberman, and Graham. Senator Rand Paul, Ron Paul's son, I'm sure, will mount a valiant resistance against it. If the current of public opinion, though, is swayed by all of the propaganda for war that we've seen in the mainstream media and among the other Republican candidates, then I fear we'll be having a repeat of the kinds of media manipulations and the kinds of propaganda campaigns that led to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I actually believed that propaganda back then when it was disseminated. And I really hope that people today, especially people who really do try to think about these matters and pursue the truth, do not get deceived the same way that I was deceived back then. Thank you very much. I hope that this has shed some light as to why we really urgently need someone like Ron Paul as president and as the decision maker on foreign policy today.